The train wheezed to a stop at Silver Ridge Station, like an old man catching his breath after climbing a mountain. Steam hissed from beneath the iron beast as Evelyn Morrison stepped onto the wooden platform, her worn leather satchel clutched tight in one hand and a battered trunk dragged behind her with the other. The Colorado sun hung merciless overhead, casting sharp shadows across the dusty settlement that barely deserved the name town. She'd traveled 3 days from Kansas City, sleeping fitfully against hard wooden seats, listening to the rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel and the whispered conversations of miners heading west with dreams bigger than their pockets. Now standing in the thin mountain air with grit between her teeth and travel dust coating her black morning dress, Eve wondered if she'd made the biggest mistake of her widow's life. "Mrs. Morrison?" The voice belonged to a man tall enough to block out the sun, broad-shouldered and weathered like the surrounding peaks. Jacob Sullivan stood before her with his hat in his hands, sandy hair showing threads of premature gray and eyes the color of storm clouds. Behind him, a wagon waited with 6 small faces, peering over the sides like prairie dogs checking for danger. "Mr. Sullivan," Eve extended her hand, noting the calluses that spoke of hard work and the gentle way he helped her with the trunk. "Thank you for meeting me." "Least I could do, ma'am. The children are—" He paused, glancing back at the wagon where a boy of 11 sat with arms crossed and jaw set like granite. "Well, they're eager to meet their new teacher." The silence that followed suggested eager wasn't quite the right word. Eve straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirts, and walked toward the wagon with the same determination that had carried her through Thomas's funeral and the lonely months that followed. 6 pairs of eyes watched her approach, some curious, some guarded, and one pair so blue and trusting they nearly stopped her heart. "Are you the angel Daddy prayed for?" asked the smallest voice, belonging to a girl no more than 4 with golden curls and a smile that could melt winter. The ride to Sullivan Ranch passed in a silence broken only by wagon wheels crunching over gravel and the occasional whispered conversation between the younger children. Eve studied her new charges from her seat beside Jacob, noting details with the practiced eye of a former schoolmarm. The oldest boy, Sam, she remembered from Jacob's letters, kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his young face already showing the hard lines of someone who'd taken on too much responsibility too soon. Beside him sat a girl of about 10 with the same stubborn set to her jaw and protective eyes that rarely left her younger siblings. "That's Catherine, Kit, we call her," Jacob said quietly, following her gaze. "She's been trying to mother them all since—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Eve understood. Since Margaret died and left 6 children without an anchor in the storm, the younger children were less guarded. Rebecca, 8 years old with brown braids and ink-stained fingers, clutched a worn book to her chest like a lifeline. Thomas, Tommy to everyone, bounced in his seat with barely contained energy, his freckled face split by a gap-toothed grin as he pointed out jackrabbits and hawks to anyone who'd listen. Grace, 5 and quiet as a church mouse, kept one small hand tucked into Kit's and the other trailing along the wagon's edge, her dark eyes missing nothing. And little May, the angel seeker, had somehow wiggled her way forward to perch behind Eve's shoulder, humming a tune that sounded like wind through aspen leaves. The ranch buildings came into view as they crested a small rise. A sprawling log house with a wide porch, a red barn that had seen better days, and various outbuildings scattered around a yard worn smooth by countless feet. Behind it all, the mountains rose like cathedral spires, and to the east, Eve could see the dark scar of the silver mine that gave the settlement its name. "It ain't much to look at," Sam spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge that made Eve glance his way. "But it's ours, and we don't need nobody thinking they can come in and change things." "Samuel," Jacob's voice held a warning, but the boy just shrugged and jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "I'll see to the horses," Sam muttered, stalking toward the barn with his shoulders set like he was heading into battle. Eve climbed down more carefully, accepting Jacob's steadying hand, while taking in the organized chaos of a working ranch. Chickens scratched in the dirt near the porch steps, a milk cow lowed from a pen behind the barn, and somewhere nearby she could hear the rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood. It was exactly the kind of place where children should grow up, wild and free and safe, If only they had someone to guide them along the way. Sam don't mean nothing by it, Kit said, appearing at Eve's elbow with the loyalty of a sister and the wariness of a guardian. He just, he takes care of us. Has since Mama died. Don't like the idea of things changing, I reckon. Change can be frightening, Eve agreed, lifting May down from the wagon and setting her gently on the ground. Especially when you've already lost so much. Something in her tone must have reached Kit because the girl's defensive posture softened slightly. You lost somebody too? My husband. 2 years ago now. Did it hurt? The question came from Tommy, who'd appeared with a jackknife in one hand and a half-carved piece of wood in the other. His blue eyes, so like his father's, held the kind of direct curiosity that only children possessed. Yes, Eve said simply. It hurt very much. Does it still hurt? This time it was Grace who asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eve knelt down so she was at eye level with the children, noting how they unconsciously moved closer together, forming a protective circle. Some days, she admitted, but the hurt gets smaller when you have people to care for, when you have purpose. Is that why you came here? Rebecca spoke up, her book still pressed against her chest. For purpose? Eve looked around at the 6 faces watching her with varying degrees of hope and suspicion, then up at Jacob, who stood listening, with his hat still in his hands and something unreadable in his expression. I came here to teach, she said, but maybe purpose is what we make together. The house interior revealed the truth of 6 children living without a mother's touch. Oh, it was clean enough. Jacob clearly made an effort. But there was a masculine practicality to everything that spoke of function over comfort. The furniture was sturdy but sparse, the windows uncurtained, and the walls bare of any decoration save a single tin-type photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. That's Mama, May announced following Eve's gaze. She went to heaven when I was little. She's very beautiful, Eve said, and meant it. Margaret Sullivan had possessed the kind of natural grace that spoke of inner strength and deep contentment. She used to sing, Tommy added, abandoning his carving to flop onto a wooden chair. Real pretty like. Grace remembers some of the songs, but not all the words. Perhaps we could learn some new songs, Eve suggested. Music is an important part of education. Sam chose that moment to stomp through the kitchen door, his face flushed from stable work, and his eyes immediately finding Eve like she was an intruder to be watched. We don't need education, he said flatly. We need to work the ranch, earn our keep, and take care of ourselves. Books and songs don't put food on the table. Samuel! Jacob's voice cracked like a whip, but Sam didn't back down. It's true, Pa. What good's reading gonna do me when I'm working the mine or the cattle? What good's singing gonna do Kit when she's got washing and cooking and mending to see to? Education opens doors, Eve said quietly. It gives you choices. Choices? Sam's laugh held no humor. Like the choice to leave? Like Mama had the choice to stay instead of dying? The silence that followed was so complete Eve could hear her own heartbeat. Kit's face had gone pale, Tommy's carving forgotten in his lap, and little May's eyes filled with tears she was too young to understand. Jacob took a step toward his son, but Eve held up a gentle hand. You're right, she said, surprising everyone, including herself. Books and songs won't bring your mother back, and they won't guarantee that the people you love will stay. But they will give you tools to build something beautiful out of whatever life hands you. They'll help you honor her memory by becoming the kind of people she'd be proud of. Sam stared at her for a long moment, his young face working through emotions too complex for his 11 years. Finally, he turned and walked out without another word, letting the door slam behind him. I'm sorry, Jacob started, but Eve shook her head. Don't be. He's protecting his family the only way he knows how. That takes courage. It takes stubbornness, Kit muttered, but there was affection in her voice. Sometimes they're the same thing, Eve replied. Now shall we see about getting some supper started? I find everything looks brighter on a full stomach. As if summoned by the mention of food, the children gathered around the kitchen table, while Eve surveyed the larder with a practiced eye. There was flour, salt pork, dried beans, and a few withered vegetables that had seen better days. Not much to work with, but she'd made meals from less during the lean months after Thomas died. Rebecca, would you like to help me with the biscuits? Kit, perhaps you could set the table? Tommy, why don't you gather some eggs from the hen house? The children moved with the automatic obedience of those accustomed to chores, but Eve noticed how they kept glancing at the door, waiting for Sam's return. Even Jacob seemed restless, checking the window every few minutes. He'll come back when he's ready, Eve said, catching Jacob's worried look. Hungry boys always do. Sure enough, as the scent of baking biscuits began to fill the kitchen and the salt pork sizzled in the pan, the door creaked open and Sam slipped inside. He didn't apologize or make eye contact, just washed his hands at the pump and took his seat at the head of the table like nothing had happened. It wasn't until they were all gathered around the table, 6 children and 2 adults passing plates and pouring milk, that May piped up with the observation that would change everything. Miss Eve makes the biscuits just like Mama used to. The words hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and shimmering with memory. Sam's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Kit's eyes went wide, and Grace smiled for the first time since Eve had arrived. Mama always said the secret was buttermilk, Rebecca added softly. And not working the dough too much, Kit continued. Mine are probably different, Eve said carefully, not wanting to intrude on sacred ground. Different good, Tommy declared around a mouthful of biscuit and honey. Different like Mama would make if she was here but not trying to be Mama. Out of the mouths of babes. Eve felt tears prick her eyes at the simple wisdom of a 7-year-old boy who somehow understood what the adults were still figuring out. That night after the dishes were washed and the children tucked into their beds in the loft above, Eve sat on the porch with Jacob and listened to the sounds of the Colorado night. Somewhere an owl called across the valley, and from the direction of the mine, she could hear the distant voices of the night shift workers heading home. They took to you faster than I expected, Jacob said, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Children are resilient. They want to love and be loved. It's their nature. Even Sam, Eve smiled in the darkness. Especially Sam. He's just forgotten how to trust it won't be taken away again. Can't say I blame him for that. The pain in Jacob's voice told her more about his own struggles than a dozen conversations might have. Here was a man who'd lost his anchor and was still trying to figure out how to sail through the storm. Trust takes time, she said gently, for all of us. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast Colorado sky. Somewhere in the house, one of the children coughed softly, and Jacob tensed like he was ready to spring into action. They're fine, Eve murmured, just settling in for the night. I worry about them. Every cough, every fever, every scraped knee. Margaret always knew what to do. You know what to do too. You've kept them safe and loved for 2 years. Safe, maybe, but loved. Sometimes I wonder if I'm enough. Before Eve could respond, the screen door creaked open and May appeared in her white nightgown, rubbing sleepy eyes with small fists. Bad dream, she mumbled, climbing automatically into Jacob's lap like she'd done it 1,000 times before. What about little Dove? The train was taking Miss Eve away and I couldn't make it stop. Jacob's arms tightened around his youngest daughter while his eyes met Eve's across the porch. In that look, she saw fear and hope warring with each other. Saw a man who desperately wanted to believe in tomorrow but was terrified of losing anything else he cared about. I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart, Eve said, reaching over to smooth May's golden curls. I just got here. Promise? The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Eve knew she should be careful, should hedge her words and protect herself from promises that might be too big to keep. But looking at May's trusting face and Jacob's guarded hope, she found herself speaking from the heart instead of the head. I promise to stay as long as you need me. May smiled and snuggled deeper into her father's arms, apparently satisfied. But Eve caught the way Jacob's breath hitched slightly, saw the way his hand trembled just a bit as he stroked his daughter's hair. Later, lying in her small bedroom off the kitchen and listening to the house settle around her, Eve stared at the ceiling and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. She'd come to Silver Ridge to teach children their letters and numbers, to earn her keep and find some measure of purpose in her widowed life. She hadn't expected to find a family that needed mending or a man whose grief matched her own. She hadn't expected to feel the first stirrings of hope in 2 long years. And she definitely hadn't expected little arms sneaking around her neck in the darkness as May climbed into bed beside her, whispering, "I knew you were our angel," before falling fast asleep. Morning came with the sound of roosters crowing and children's voices drifting up from the kitchen below. Eve woke to find May still curled against her side, like a kitten seeking warmth, and the realization that she'd slept more peacefully than she had in months. Sunlight streamed through the gingham curtains. Someone had hung them while she slept. She was certain they hadn't been there the night before, and the scent of coffee drifted up from downstairs. "Come on, sleepyhead," she whispered to May, gently shaking the little girl awake. "Time to start our first real day together." May sat up with hair sticking in every direction and a smile that could power the silver mine. "Are we going to have school today?" After breakfast and chores, learning works better on a full stomach. They dressed quickly and made their way downstairs to find organized chaos in the kitchen. Kit stood at the stove, flipping flapjacks with the competence of someone twice her age, while Tommy and Grace set the table with mismatched plates and bent silverware. Rebecca sat in the corner, reading aloud from a battered copy of McGuffey's Reader to anyone who'd listen, and Sam was nowhere to be seen. "He's already gone to help Pa with the morning milking," Kit explained without being asked. "Always gets up before dawn. Says somebody's got to be the man of the house." Eve felt a pang for the boy who'd had to grow up too fast, taking on burdens that should have belonged to adults. "Well then, we'll save him some breakfast. Growing boys need their fuel." "Miss Eve?" Grace appeared at her elbow with a shy smile. "Would you like to see Mama's garden?" Kit's been trying to keep it up, but she says she don't have the touch. The garden turned out to be a patch of earth behind the house that showed signs of loving care, followed by well-meaning neglect. Rows that had once been arrow-straight now wavered like uncertain paths, and weeds competed with vegetables for space and sunlight. But underneath the chaos, Eve could see good bones. Rich soil, smart planting, and plants that wanted to thrive if given half a chance. "Mama grew all kinds of things," Grace said, kneeling beside a struggling patch of what might have been carrots. "Vegetables for eating, flowers for pretty, and special plants for when folks got sick." "Special plants? Like this one?" Grace pointed to a small, unassuming plant with serrated leaves. "Mama called it fever reducer, and this here's for when your stomach hurts." She moved to another patch where mint had taken over like an aromatic army. Eve knelt beside the little girl, recognizing feverfew and peppermint among the volunteers. "Your mama was very wise. These are good medicine plants." "You know about medicine plants, too?" "Some. My grandmother taught me when I was about your age." Eve gently touched the feverfew, memory carrying her back to long summer afternoons spent in her grandmother's herb garden, learning the difference between healing and helping. "Would you like to help me get this garden sorted out? We could plant some new things, save the good plants your mama started." Grace's face lit up like sunrise. "Could we really? Kit says I just get in the way when she tries to garden." "Kit's doing her best, but she's got a lot on her shoulders. Maybe we can help each other." They spent the next hour surveying the garden and making plans, with Grace proving to be a wealth of information about her mother's methods and preferences. The child had clearly spent many happy hours at Margaret's side, absorbing knowledge with the unconscious ease of the very young. "Miss Eve! Miss Eve!" Tommy's voice carried across the yard with the urgency that made every adult heart skip a beat. "Come quick!" "Grace is hurt." But Grace was right beside her, dirty hands and bright eyes proving she was perfectly fine. Eve looked around to see Tommy racing toward them with panic written across his freckled face, and behind him, a cluster of figures near the barn. They ran toward the commotion to find Sam kneeling beside a girl of about Grace's age, who definitely wasn't one of the Sullivan children. The newcomer had dark hair escaping from braids and was clutching her left arm against her chest, while tears streamed down a face pale with pain. "This is Maria Santos," Sam explained tersely. "Her papa works the mine. She was trying to climb up to the hayloft and fell." Eve dropped to her knees beside the injured child, her teacher's training and grandmother's wisdom combining into swift action. "Hello, Maria. I'm Miss Morrison. Can you tell me where it hurts?" "My arm," Maria whispered in accented English. I think, I think it's broken. A gentle examination confirmed the worst. The arm was definitely fractured, though thankfully it appeared to be a clean break. Maria bore the examination with the stoic courage of a child accustomed to hardship, but Eve could see the pain and fear lurking behind her dark eyes. Sam, I need you to ride for your father. Tommy, bring me some clean cloth from the house. Pillowcases will do. Kit, can you find me 2 pieces of flat wood about this long? Eve demonstrated with her hands. And Grace, I need you to pick me some willow bark from the tree by the creek. Strip it carefully like your mama taught you. The children scattered like leaves in the wind, each focused on their assigned task, with the efficiency that spoke of a family accustomed to working together in crisis. Maria watched them go with wide eyes. Are you a doctor, lady? She asked. No, sweetheart. Just someone who's learned a thing or two about helping hurt folks feel better. By the time Jacob arrived at a gallop with dust streaming behind his horse, Eve had Maria's arms splinted and secured, and was brewing willow bark tea over the kitchen fire, while Grace held the injured girl's good hand and told her stories about the chickens' personalities. How bad? Jacob asked quietly, his face grim with the knowledge that in a place like Silver Ridge, a bad injury could mean the difference between working and starving. Clean break. She'll need to see the doctor in town to have it set properly, but she'll heal fine with proper care. Doc Henderson's in Leadville this week. Won't be back till Friday. Eve felt her heart sink. Friday was 4 days away, too long for a child to wait with a broken arm. Then we'll have to do our best until he returns. You know how to set bones? My grandmother did. She taught me some, but Eve hesitated, torn between caution and necessity. I'm not a doctor, Jacob. If something went wrong— Miss Eve, Maria's small voice interrupted the adult conversation. My mama, she set my uncle's arm when the mine roof fell on him. She said God gives people healing hands when they're needed most. Looking down at the brave little girl with her trusting dark eyes, Eve felt something shift inside her chest. Maybe it was foolish pride. Maybe it was divine inspiration. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that sometimes you had to choose between risk and certain suffering. All right, she said quietly, but I'll need help. What followed was the longest hour of Eve's life. With Jacob holding Maria steady and the Sullivan children assisting with quiet competence that spoke volumes about their upbringing, Eve carefully manipulated the broken bones back into alignment. Maria bit down on a piece of leather and squeezed Grace's hand hard enough to leave marks, but she didn't cry out once. When it was done and the arm properly splinted, Maria looked up at Eve with something approaching worship in her dark eyes. Gracias, señora. You do have healing hands. We all do, Eve replied, smoothing the child's hair back from her sweaty forehead. Sometimes we just have to learn how to use them. Jacob insisted on driving Maria home personally, leaving Eve with strict instructions to keep the children close and the doors locked until he returned. It was only after the wagon disappeared down the dusty road that Kit approached her with an expression Eve was learning to recognize, the look of a child trying to process something too big for her years. That was real doctoring you did, Kit said matter-of-factly. Not just teaching or cooking or cleaning. Real doctoring like Mama used to do. Your mother was a healer. Mama helped birth babies and set bones and cured fevers, Tommy piped up with evident pride. Folks came from all over the valley when they needed help. Pa said she had a gift. Said God gave her hands that could mend what was broken, Rebecca added, looking up from her ever-present book. Eve felt a strange shiver run down her spine, as if Margaret Sullivan's spirit had somehow guided her hands during that long, careful hour in the barn. Your mother sounds like a very special woman. She was, Sam's voice came from the barn doorway, where he'd been standing unnoticed. And now you're here, doing the same thing she used to do. There was something in his tone that Eve couldn't quite read. Not quite acceptance, but not the hostility of yesterday either. It was as if seeing her tend to Maria had shifted something in his perception, opened a door he'd been determined to keep closed. I only did what anyone would do, Eve said carefully. No. Sam stepped fully into the barn, his young face serious beyond his years. Most folks would have waited for the doc, even if it meant that little girl suffering for days. You didn't wait. Sometimes waiting isn't an option. Yeah, Sam nodded slowly. Mama used to say that too. That afternoon, Eve finally got her first real chance to assess the children's educational needs. She'd set up a makeshift classroom on the big kitchen table, using Rebecca's battered reader and some slate boards Jacob had found in the barn as teaching materials. The results were about what she'd expected from children who'd been largely self-taught for the past 2 years. Rebecca was actually ahead of her age level, devouring books with the hunger of someone who'd discovered treasure. Kit could read simple passages and had a good head for practical mathematics. She'd been managing the household accounts after all. But the younger children struggled with letters. And Sam— "I don't see the point," Sam declared, when Eve tried to get him to work through a basic arithmetic problem. "I can count cattle and figure change at the store. What more do I need?" "Can you read contracts?" Eve asked mildly. "Calculate interest on loans? Write a letter to government officials if the mine company tries to cheat your neighbors?" Sam's jaw tightened. "That's not likely to happen." "No. Your friend Maria's father works the mine. How much does he earn per day? What percentage goes to the company store? How much interest are they charging him for credit against future wages?" The silence that followed told Eve everything she needed to know. Sam might be mature beyond his years, but he was still a child trying to navigate an adult world without all the tools he needed. "Knowledge is power," Eve continued gently, "and power is what protects the people we love." Something flickered in Sam's eyes. Interest, maybe, or the first stirrings of understanding. "Will you teach me about contracts and loans and such?" "If you'll let me teach you reading and writing first. Can't understand contracts if you can't read them." It was a breakthrough of sorts, small but significant. By the time Jacob returned from the Santos farm, all 6 children were gathered around the kitchen table working on their lessons with varying degrees of enthusiasm and success. "How's Maria?" Eve asked as Jacob hung his hat by the door. "Resting comfortable. Her mother sends her thanks and—" Jacob paused, seeming to struggle with something. "She said to tell you that word's already spreading about what you did. Folks are calling you La Curandera, the healer." "I'm not a healer," Eve protested. "I'm a teacher who knows a little about herbs and bones." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Grace piped up from her seat at the table. "Mama always said healing comes in lots of different ways. Some folks heal bodies, some heal hearts, some heal minds." "Out of the mouths of babes, indeed." Eve looked around the table at 6 children bent over their slates, working problems and practicing letters with the concentrated focus of those who discovered learning could be an adventure rather than a chore. Maybe Grace was right. Maybe healing did come in many forms. And maybe, just maybe, she'd found the place where her own healing could begin. 3 weeks into Eve's tenure at Sullivan Ranch, the autumn routine had settled into something approaching normalcy. Mornings began with chores and breakfast, followed by lessons around the kitchen table that increasingly felt less like formal schooling and more like family conversations that happened to involve books and slates. Afternoons meant practical work, tending the recovering garden, mending clothes, or helping with ranch tasks. And evenings brought storytelling, music, and the kind of easy companionship that Eve had thought she'd never experience again. The children had adapted to her presence with the resilience of youth, though each in their own way. Rebecca had attached herself to Eve like a shadow, hungry for every scrap of literary discussion and advanced reading material. Tommy had appointed himself as her personal protector, insisting on carrying her books and walking between her and any perceived danger, including suspicious-looking chickens. Grace continued to be her guide through Margaret's herb garden, which was slowly returning to organized productivity under their combined care. Kit had perhaps made the most dramatic transformation, gradually shedding the rigid responsibility that had weighed down her 10-year-old shoulders and rediscovering the child she'd been forced to abandon too early. She'd even started laughing again, something Jacob mentioned with wonder in his voice during their evening conversations on the porch. May, of course, had never questioned Eve's place in their family from the moment she'd asked about angels. The little girl had taken to calling Eve Miss Mama Eve, a compromise that made everyone smile and no one corrected. Even Sam had begun to thaw, though he maintained his protective vigilance with the dedication of a professional soldier. He'd thrown himself into his studies with the same fierce determination he brought to everything else, and Eve was amazed at how quickly his sharp mind absorbed new concepts once he decided they were worth learning. Jacob himself remained something of a mystery, warm and grateful during family meals, easy to talk with during their evening conversations, but always maintaining a careful distance that spoke of a man still learning to trust his own heart. It was this fragile new piece that made the morning's events so jarring. Eve woke to the sound of horses approaching at speed, followed by urgent voices in the yard below. She dressed quickly and hurried downstairs to find Jacob already pulling on his boots while the children clustered around the windows, trying to see what was happening. "Stay inside," Jacob ordered tersely, reaching for the rifle that hung above the fireplace. "All of you." Through the kitchen window, Eve could see three men dismounting from lathered horses. They wore the rough clothes of miners, but their faces carried the grim urgency that spoke of serious trouble. "Mr. Sullivan," the lead rider's voice carried clearly across the yard. "There's been a cave-in at the mine. Half the night shift is trapped, and we need all the help we can get." Jacob was already moving toward the door, but Eve caught his arm. "What about the children? They'll be safe here. Lock the doors, keep them inside, and I'm coming with you." The words surprised Eve as much as they did Jacob. She hadn't planned to volunteer, hadn't even thought about it consciously. But the image of Maria Santos rose in her mind, followed by thoughts of all the other families in Silver Ridge who depended on the mine for their survival. "Eve, it's dangerous. Cave-ins mean injuries, maybe worse. It's no place for a woman or for someone with healing hands." Jacob stared at her for a moment, his storm gray eyes reflecting a dozen different emotions. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Kit, you're in charge. Keep everyone together, and don't let anyone leave the house for any reason. We'll be back as soon as we can." The ride to the mine passed in a blur of dust and urgent conversation. The cave-in had happened during the pre-dawn shift change, trapping 12 men in the deepest tunnel while their relief workers were still making their way down. The mine foreman, a grizzled Irishman named Patrick O'Malley, met them at the entrance with his face black with coal dust and his eyes dark with worry. "It's bad, Sullivan," he said without preamble. "The main support timber snapped, brought down half the tunnel roof. We can hear voices, but there's no telling how bad they're hurt or how long the air will last." Eve looked around at the organized chaos surrounding the mine entrance. Men with shovels and picks attacking the wall of rubble, others hauling out buckets of broken rock and splintered wood. The wives and children of the trapped miners had gathered in a tight cluster near the mine office, their faces reflecting every emotion from hope to despair. "How can I help?" Eve asked O'Malley. "He'll make it," Eve said with more confidence than she felt. "Your friend is tougher than old leather." As if summoned by her words, Jim's eyes fluttered open. "Bobby?" he croaked. "Right here, Jim. Right here, thanks to you." The old miner managed a weak smile. "Somebody's got to look after you young fools." It was then that Patrick O'Malley approached with his hat in his hands and his face grave. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to speak with you." Eve followed him a few steps away from the injured men, noting how the families of the rescued miners parted respectfully as she passed. Word of her work had spread through the crowd, and she could feel their gratitude and something approaching reverence following her like a warm cloak. "There's one more man down there," O'Malley said quietly. "Thomas Brennan. The tunnel collapsed completely just past where we found Walsh. We can't hear anything from beyond the fall." Eve felt her heart sink. She'd been counting heads, hoping against hope that everyone would make it out alive. How long would it take to dig through? Hours, maybe days. And there's no guarantee the tunnel won't collapse further if we try. O'Malley's voice was heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. "His wife is here, with 3 little ones. Someone needs to tell her." Eve looked across the crowd until she spotted a young woman with auburn hair and a face pinched with worry, holding a baby while 2 small children clung to her skirts. The woman's eyes met hers across the distance, and Eve saw the exact moment when hope turned to dread. "I'll talk to her," Eve said quietly. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "I'll talk to her." Mary Brennan received the news with the stoic courage of a woman who'd always known this day might come. She asked only one question. "Did he suffer?" "The cave-in would have been quick," Eve said gently, taking the woman's free hand in both of hers. He wouldn't have known what happened. Mary nodded once, then looked down at the baby in her arms. A little girl no more than 6 months old with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, and the question contained all the fear and desperation of a widow facing an uncertain future. "You're going to take it one day at a time," Eve said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "And you're not going to do it alone." It was a promise she made without thinking, but one that felt as solid and true as bedrock the moment the words left her mouth. Around them, the other mining families nodded their agreement, a community that had learned the hard lesson that survival depended on taking care of each other. The ride back to the ranch took place in exhausted silence. Sam dozed against Eve's shoulder, while Jacob guided the wagon through the gathering darkness, his hands steady on the reins despite the fatigue that lined his face. Behind them, the lights of Silver Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had either been reunited or forever changed by the day's events. "You did good today," Jacob said quietly as they turned into the ranch yard. "Better than good. You saved lives." "We all did. That's what people do when trouble comes. They help each other. Not everyone. Some folks talk about helping, but when the time comes to actually get their hands dirty..." Jacob shook his head. "You didn't hesitate, didn't count the cost or worry about what people might think. You just acted." Eve helped Sam down from the wagon, noting how the boy straightened his shoulders despite his exhaustion, still trying to be the man of the family even in his sleep-deprived state. Sometimes acting is easier than thinking? Maybe, or maybe some people are just built different. Before Eve could ask what he meant by that, the ranch house door burst open and the other children came pouring out in a tumble of questions and relief. Kit reached them first, her face pale but determined as she took inventory of everyone's condition. "Are you hurt? Either of you?" "Just tired," Eve assured her, accepting May's fierce hug and Tommy's slightly embarrassed but equally tight embrace. "Very, very tired." The foreman looked her up and down with the assessment of a man who'd spent his life measuring people's usefulness in crisis situations. "You're the teacher lady, right? The one who set young Maria's arm?" "I am." "Good. We'll need someone with medical knowledge once we get them out. Could be broken bones, could be worse." He paused, his expression grim. "Could be we'll need someone to tend to the ones who don't make it out." The next 6 hours tested Eve in ways she'd never imagined. As the rescue work continued with agonizing slowness, she found herself moving between the families of the trapped men, offering what comfort she could while trying to prepare for whatever medical emergencies might emerge from the darkness below. She'd sent word back to the ranch for her herbs and medical supplies, and Sam had arrived within an hour driving the wagon at dangerous speed with Kit beside him and a canvas bag full of everything Eve might need. The boy had taken one look at the situation and announced that he was staying to help, ignoring his father's protest with the stubborn determination that was becoming his trademark. "Somebody needs to hold horses and carry water and run messages," Sam declared. "Might as well be me." It was Sam who first heard the voices when the rescue team finally broke through the wall of debris. Faint calls from the darkness beyond, confirming that at least some of the trapped men were still alive. It was Sam who helped organize the relay of buckets and timber as the narrow tunnel was slowly, carefully expanded. And it was Sam who stood beside Eve as the first injured miner was brought blinking into the sunlight, his leg bent at an unnatural angle and his face gray with pain. "Maria's papa," Sam said quietly, and Eve felt her heart clench as she recognized Pedro Santos, despite the blood and coal dust coating his features. What followed was the longest day of Eve's life. One by one, the trapped miners were brought out, some walking, some carried, all bearing the marks of their ordeal in the darkness. She set bones and stitched cuts, brewed willow bark tea for pain and fever, few preparations for the inevitable fevers that would follow. She held the hand of a young miner barely older than Sam as he cried for his mother in words she didn't understand but recognized in her heart. And through it all, Jacob worked alongside the other rescuers, his powerful frame hauling timber and moving rock with the mechanical persistence of a man driven by something deeper than mere duty. More than once, Eve caught him glancing her way as she worked over an injured man, and something in his expression made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. It was nearly sunset when they brought out the last survivor, a veteran miner named Jim Walsh, who'd used his own body to shield a younger man from falling debris. Both his arms were broken, and he'd lost consciousness from pain and exhaustion. Eve worked over him with hands that no longer trembled, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Will he make it?" the young miner he'd protected asked anxiously. Bobby Turner was barely 18, with soft features that spoke of a life that should have been spent in schoolrooms rather than mineshafts. "He'll make it," Eve said with more confidence than she felt. "Your friend is tougher than old leather." As if summoned by her words, Jim's eyes fluttered open. "Bobby," he croaked. "Right here, Jim. Right here, thanks to you." The old miner managed a weak smile. "Somebody's got to look after you young fools." It was then that Patrick O'Malley approached with his hat in his hands and his face grave. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to speak with you." Eve followed him a few steps away from the injured men, noting how the families of the rescued miners parted respectfully as she passed. Word of her work had spread through the crowd, and she could feel their gratitude and something approaching reverence following her like a warm cloak. "There's one more man down there," O'Malley said quietly. "Thomas Brennan." The tunnel collapsed completely just past where we found Walsh. We can't hear anything from beyond the fall. Eve felt her heart sink. She'd been counting heads, hoping against hope that everyone would make it out alive. How long would it take to dig through? Hours, maybe days. And there's no guarantee the tunnel won't collapse further if we try. O'Malley's voice was heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. "His wife is here, with 3 little ones. Someone needs to tell her." Eve looked across the crowd until she spotted a young woman with auburn hair and a face pinched with worry, holding a baby, while 2 small children clung to her skirts. The woman's eyes met hers across the distance, and Eve saw the exact moment when hope turned to dread. "I'll talk to her," Eve said quietly. "Ma'am, I don't think—" "I'll talk to her." Mary Brennan received the news with the stoic courage of a woman who'd always known this day might come. She asked only one question. "Did he suffer?" "The cave-in would have been quick," Eve said gently, taking the woman's free hand in both of hers. "He wouldn't have known what happened." Mary nodded once, then looked down at the baby in her arms. A little girl, no more than 6 months old, with her father's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. And the question contained all the fear and desperation of a widow facing an uncertain future. "You're going to take it one day at a time," Eve said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "And you're not going to do it alone." It was a promise she made without thinking, but one that felt as solid and true as bedrock the moment the words left her mouth. Around them, the other mining families nodded their agreement, a community that had learned the hard lesson that survival depended on taking care of each other. The ride back to the ranch took place in exhausted silence. Sam dozed against Eve's shoulder, while Jacob guided the wagon through the gathering darkness, his hands steady on the reins despite the fatigue that lined his face. Behind them, the lights of Silver Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family that had either been reunited or forever changed by the day's events. "You did good today," Jacob said quietly as they turned into the ranch yard. "Better than good. You saved lives. We all did. That's what people do when trouble comes. They help each other. Not everyone. Some folks talk about helping, but when the time comes to actually get their hands dirty..." Jacob shook his head. "You didn't hesitate. Didn't count the cost or worry about what people might think. You just acted." Eve helped Sam down from the wagon, noting how the boy straightened his shoulders despite his exhaustion, still trying to be the man of the family even in his sleep-deprived state. "Sometimes acting is easier than thinking." "Maybe. Or maybe some people are just built different." Before Eve could ask what he meant by that, the ranch house door burst open and the other children came pouring out in a tumble of questions and relief. Kit reached them first, her face pale but determined as she took inventory of everyone's condition. "Are you hurt? Either of you?" "Just tired," Eve assured her, accepting May's fierce hug and Tommy's slightly embarrassed but equally tight embrace. "Very, very tired. We heard about the cave-in from Mrs. Henderson when she brought eggs by," Rebecca said, her usual composure cracked by hours of worry. She said lots of men were hurt. Some were hurt, but they're all going to be fine, Eve said, deciding the children didn't need to know about Thomas Brennan tonight. That grief could wait until morning, when she'd had time to figure out how to explain death to young hearts that had already endured too much loss. Except for Mr. Brennan, Sam said quietly, proving once again that 11-year-old boys heard more than adults assumed they did. He didn't make it out. The silence that followed was broken only by Grace's soft intake of breath, and May's whispered, "Oh no." "Mrs. Brennan's going to need help," Kit said after a moment, her practical mind already working through the implications. "She's got 3 little ones and no husband to work the mine." "The community will take care of her," Jacob said firmly. "That's what we do here." "What about her babies?" May asked, her blue eyes wide with concern. "Who's going to take care of her babies?" "Lots of people," Eve said, kneeling down to May's level. "Mrs. Santos will help, and Mrs. O'Malley, and Mrs. Henderson. The whole town will help." "Will you help too?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and shimmering with possibility. Eve looked around at 6 worried faces and one adult's carefully neutral expression, and felt the weight of another promise settling on her shoulders. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll help too." That night, after the children were finally settled and the house had grown quiet around them, Eve sat on the porch with Jacob and tried to process everything that had happened. Her hands still smelled of carbolic acid and willow bark, and her back ached from hours of bending over injured men. But there was something else too, a sense of rightness, of purpose, that she hadn't felt since Thomas died. "Penny for your thoughts," Jacob said, offering her a cup of coffee that was probably stronger than it should be, but tasted like heaven after the day they'd had. "I was thinking about healing," Eve said slowly, "about how it comes in different forms, like Grace said. Today I helped heal bodies, but I think something in me got healed too." "How so?" Eve was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something that felt almost too sacred to speak aloud. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. Thought the best I could hope for was to exist quietly until it was my turn to join him. But today, when I was setting bones and brewing medicine and holding Mary Brennan's hand while she cried, I felt useful again, needed, like maybe God wasn't done with me yet." Jacob's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. "Maybe he was just waiting for you to find the right place to do your work. Maybe, or maybe the right place found me." They sat holding hands in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and the distant echo of voices from the mining settlement. Somewhere in the darkness, a woman was grieving the loss of her husband, while 3 small children slept in peaceful ignorance of how their world had changed. Tomorrow, Eve would begin the work of helping them navigate their new reality, just as she was learning to navigate her own. "Eve?" Jacob's voice was quiet, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. What you said today, about Mary Brennan not being alone, did you mean that?" Eve turned to look at him, noting the vulnerability in his expression that the darkness couldn't quite hide. "Every word. Good. Because I meant what I said too, about this community taking care of its own. That includes you now, you know. Whatever you need, whatever the future brings, you're not alone either." The promise hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Eve felt her heart begin to beat faster with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear, or maybe both at once. "Jacob?" "Yes. Thank you for bringing me here, for trusting me with your children, for letting me be part of this." His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Thank you for saying yes." Later, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the house settle around her, Eve stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the day's revelations. She'd come to Silver Ridge to teach children their letters and numbers, to earn her keep and find some small measure of purpose in her widowed life. She hadn't expected to discover that healing could take so many forms, or that sometimes the act of mending others could help mend the broken places in yourself. She hadn't expected to feel the first stirrings of something deeper than gratitude toward the man who'd given her this chance. And she definitely hadn't expected the soft knock on her door that came just after midnight, followed by May's whispered, "Miss Mama Eve?" I had another bad dream. Eve opened her arms without hesitation, gathering the little girl close and murmuring the same words her own mother had once used to chase away nighttime fears. As May's breathing gradually slowed and deepened into peaceful sleep, Eve found herself making another silent promise, not just to stay as long as she was needed, but to protect and nurture this fragile new family with everything she had. Outside, Silver Ridge slept under a canopy of stars, its dreams haunted by the day's tragedy, but warmed by the knowledge that when trouble came, the community would face it together. And in a small bedroom off the kitchen of Sullivan Ranch, a widow and an orphan found comfort in each other's arms, building the foundation of something that might, with time and faith, grow into the family they both desperately needed. The weeks following the mine accident brought changes to Silver Ridge that rippled through the community like stones thrown into still water. Mary Brennan and her 3 children had been taken in by her sister's family in town, but the financial strain was evident to anyone with eyes to see. The mining company, citing safety concerns and operational challenges, had cut wages across the board and reduced working hours, leaving families already living on the margins struggling to make ends meet. It was against this backdrop of uncertainty that Eve found herself becoming something she'd never intended to be. Not just a teacher for the Sullivan children, but an informal educator for any child in Silver Ridge whose parents could spare them for a few hours of learning. It started with Bobby Turner, the young miner whose life Jim Walsh had saved in the cave-in. Bobby appeared at the ranch one morning with his hat in his hands and a request that took Eve completely by surprise. "Mrs. Morrison, I was wondering, that is, I was hoping maybe you could teach me to read proper." Eve looked up from where she was helping Rebecca with her advanced arithmetic, noting the way Bobby's face flushed red with embarrassment at having to ask. "You don't read, Bobby." "Not much more than my name and simple words. Ma died when I was 8, and Pa needed me in the fields. Never had much time for schooling." He shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "But after what happened in the mine, after seeing how Mr. Walsh saved my life and all, I've been thinking maybe I ought to make something more of myself. Learn things that might help me get work that don't involve going underground." Before Eve could respond, Sam looked up from his own studies with an expression of interest. "You could join our lessons. We got plenty of room at the table." "I couldn't impose." "It's not imposing," Rebecca interjected with the authority of someone who'd recently discovered the joy of learning. "Miss Eve says education is meant to be shared, not hoarded." Eve felt a warm glow of pride at hearing her own words reflected back to her. "Rebecca's right. Besides, teaching older students helps me be a better teacher for the younger ones." "When can you come?" Bobby's face lit up like sunrise. "Mornings mostly. Mine companies only got work for 3 days a week now, so I got time on my hands." Within a week, Bobby had been joined by Maria Santos, whose broken arm had healed straight and strong, but whose thirst for knowledge had only grown during her recovery. Then came the Henderson twins, whose mother was struggling to manage the farm alone after her husband took a job in Leadville. Soon, Eve found herself teaching a mixed-age group of 12 children around the Sullivan kitchen table, with lessons that ranged from basic alphabet recognition to advanced reading comprehension. "You realize what you're doing, don't you?" Jacob asked one evening as they watched the children work together on a geography project that involved mapping the Colorado Territory. "Teaching? Building something. A real school, right here in our kitchen." Eve looked around at the controlled chaos of children bent over books and slates, helping each other with problems and sharing discoveries with the enthusiasm of natural explorers. Bobby was patiently helping little May trace her letters, while Maria translated difficult English words for the younger Santos children who'd started attending. Sam had appointed himself as the unofficial supervisor of mathematics, checking everyone's arithmetic with the serious attention of a bank examiner. "It's working, isn't it?" Eve said wonderingly. "They're actually learning. More than that, they're learning to help each other learn. That's something special." It was special, Eve realized. In her previous teaching experience back in Kansas, she'd worked with children from similar backgrounds in rigidly structured, classrooms where age segregation was the norm. Here, necessity had created something more organic. Older children mentoring younger ones, different learning styles accommodating each other, and a sense of shared discovery that made every lesson feel like an adventure. Miss Eve, Grace appeared at her elbow with a book tucked under her arm. Could you help me with this word? I think it's important. The book was one of Margaret's herb guides, and the word that had stopped Grace was tincture. As Eve explained the meaning and pronunciation, she noticed several other children gathering around to listen. Soon she found herself giving an impromptu lesson on medicinal plants that held everyone's attention far longer than any formal botany class she'd ever taught. My mama makes tinctures, Maria volunteered. She's been teaching me which plants help with different problems. Could she come teach us sometime? Rebecca asked eagerly. I'd love to learn more about healing plants. And just like that, another seed was planted. Within days, Consuela Santos had become a regular visitor to the ranch, sharing her extensive knowledge of traditional remedies and adding a richness to the children's education that no textbook could provide. Other parents began volunteering their expertise as well. Patrick O'Malley taught a fascinating lesson on geology and mining techniques, while Mary Henderson shared her knowledge of preserving food and managing livestock. You're creating something amazing here, Jacob said one afternoon as they watched Consuela demonstrate how to prepare a poultice for sprains, while a dozen children took careful notes. A real community school. It's creating itself, Eve replied, but she felt a deep satisfaction watching the organic growth of what they were building together. I'm just trying to keep up. The change in the children was remarkable, but perhaps none more so than in Sam. The boy who'd initially resisted education with the stubbornness of a mule had become one of its most passionate advocates, not just for himself but for others. He'd started visiting families in town, encouraging parents to send their children to the ranch for lessons, and offering to help with chores in exchange for educational opportunities. It's like he's found his calling, Kid observed one evening as they watched Sam patiently help Bobby with a particularly challenging reading passage. Ma always said Sam had a gift for bringing people together, but we never saw it before because he was too busy trying to hold us all together by himself. Eve nodded, remembering her first impression of Sam as a boy forced to grow up too fast. Now she could see the natural leader underneath the protective facade, someone who understood that true strength came from lifting others up rather than standing alone. Your mother was a wise woman, Eve said softly. She would have liked what you're doing here, Kit replied. She always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you, no matter how hard times got. It was during the 4th week of their expanded school that the real test came. Eve was in the middle of a reading lesson when Bobby suddenly stood up from the table, his face pale and his hands shaking. I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but I got to go. Mr. Jameson from the mine company is here, and when company men come calling, it usually means trouble. Through the kitchen window, Eve could see a well-dressed man in a city suit standing beside a fancy buggy, talking to Jacob near the barn. Even from a distance, she could read the tension in Jacob's posture. Children, please continue with your reading, Eve said calmly. Sam, you're in charge. I'll be back in a few minutes. She walked out to where Jacob stood facing the company representative, a thin man with calculating eyes and the kind of smile that never quite reached its destination. Ah, you must be the famous Mrs. Morrison, the man said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Theodore Jameson, Western Mining Consortium. I've been hearing interesting stories about the little school you've established here. Mr. Jameson, Eve replied coolly. How can we help you? Well, it's more a matter of how I can help you, ma'am. You see, the company has been evaluating educational needs in the area, and we're prepared to offer you a position as the official school marm for Silver Ridge. Proper salary, dedicated building, all the resources you need. Eve felt Jacob tense beside her, but kept her own expression neutral. That's very generous. What would be expected in return? Jameson's smile widened. Nothing unreasonable. Standard curriculum, of course. Focus on practical skills that will prepare children for productive employment. And naturally, we'd want to ensure that the education provided aligns with the company's values and interests, which are creating a stable, productive workforce, teaching children their proper place in society, discouraging unrealistic ambitions that might lead to discontent or labor troubles. The meaning was crystal clear, and Eve felt anger rise in her chest like a tide. Jameson wanted to control what the children learned, to limit their horizons and ensure they grew up to be compliant workers rather than independent thinkers. I see, Eve said carefully. And what about the families who can't afford to send their children to a company school? What about the older students like Bobby Turner, who are trying to better themselves? Jameson waved dismissively. The company school would be for employees' children only, naturally. As for adult education, he shrugged. Hardly practical. Better to focus resources where they'll do the most good. I'm afraid I'll have to decline your offer, Eve said firmly. I beg your pardon? I said no. Thank you. I'm quite happy with the arrangement I have here. Jameson's smile finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Mrs. Morrison, I don't think you understand the reality of your situation. You're operating an unlicensed school on private property, teaching children without proper oversight or curriculum approval. The territorial government takes educational standards very seriously. Are you threatening us, Mr. Jameson? Jacob's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath the calm tone. Merely pointing out facts, Mr. Sullivan. Mrs. Morrison's little enterprise exists purely at the sufferance of the authorities. It would be unfortunate if someone were to file a complaint about unauthorized educational activities. Eve felt her heart sink as the implications became clear. Jameson had the power to shut down their school with a few words to the right officials, and everyone in the territory knew that the mining companies had more influence with the government than ordinary citizens. How long do I have to consider your offer? She asked quietly. Oh, I think a week should be sufficient. I'll return next Tuesday for your answer. Jameson climbed back into his buggy with the satisfaction of a man who knew he held all the cards. Good day, Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Sullivan. They watched in silence as the buggy disappeared down the road, leaving only dust and the bitter taste of ultimatum hanging in the air. We could fight it, Jacob said finally. Get a lawyer, challenge their authority to shut down a private school. With what money? And what happens to the children while we're fighting? They can't afford to lose months of education while lawyers argue in courtrooms. Jacob's jaw tightened. So what do we do? Eve looked back toward the house, where she could see the children through the kitchen window, still bent over their books with the concentration of young minds discovering the world. Bobby was helping May with her letters, Maria was explaining something to the Henderson twins in rapid Spanish and English, and Sam was demonstrating a mathematics concept with the patient authority of a natural teacher. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I'm not giving up without a fight. That evening, after the visiting children had returned to their families and the Sullivan children were finally settled for the night, Eve sat on the porch with Jacob and tried to figure out a solution that didn't exist. Maybe I should take his offer, she said reluctantly. At least some of the children would still get an education, even if it's not the kind I choose. And the others? Bobby, Maria, the Henderson twins? What happens to them? They'd have to make do without, the way they did before I came. No, Jacob's voice was firm. You can't sacrifice the many for the few, but you can't sacrifice the few for the many either. There has to be another way. What way? Jameson holds all the cards and we both know it. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening mountains with the expression of a man wrestling with demons. Finally, he turned to face her directly. There is one option. You could marry me. Eve felt her heart stop. What? Think about it. A married woman running a school on her husband's property, teaching their own children and a few neighbors. Much harder for the territorial government to challenge, especially if the husband in question used to be a sheriff and has friends in the right places. Jacob? Eve struggled to find words. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. It would solve the immediate problem, give you legal protection, and... He paused, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. And it would make me the happiest man in Colorado territory. Eve stared at him in the darkness, her mind reeling with the implications of what he was suggesting. Marriage of convenience, or something more. The children, she managed finally, would be overjoyed. Eve, they already think of you as their mother. Making it official would just be acknowledging what's already true. But what about love? What about Jacob's hand found hers, just as it had on the night of the mine accident? I can't promise you the kind of love poets write about. I'm not sure I remember how to feel that anymore. But I can promise you respect, partnership, and a home where you'll always be valued for exactly who you are. And if someday you do remember how to love, what if you meet someone who makes your heart sing the way Margaret did? Jacob was quiet for so long, Eve began to think he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Margaret's been gone for 4 years, Eve. 4 years of going through the motions of living while feeling dead inside. But these past weeks, watching you with the children, seeing you bring light back into this house, I think maybe my heart is already starting to remember. Eve felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from something far more complex. Jacob, I care about you, about all of you. But marriage is scary as hell, he finished for her. Trust me, I know. But sometimes the scariest choices are the ones that lead to the best outcomes. They sat in silence for a while, holding hands and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called across the valley, and from the direction of town, Eve could hear the distant sound of a harmonica playing a lonely tune. Can I have time to think about it? She asked finally. All the time you need. But Eve, yes? Whatever you decide, it won't change how I feel about having you here. You've given me back my children's laughter and reminded me that there's still good in the world worth fighting for. That's enough, no matter what comes next. As Eve lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to May's soft breathing beside her, she found herself thinking about all the ways her life had changed since arriving in Silver Ridge. She'd come looking for purpose and found family. She'd come seeking simple work and discovered a calling. She'd come expecting to teach children and ended up learning lessons about love, loss, and the courage it took to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of the past. Marriage to Jacob would solve their immediate problems, but it would also mean stepping fully into a life she'd never imagined for herself. Could she be wife to a man still learning to trust his own heart? Could she be mother to 6 children who'd already lost so much? Could she be the kind of woman who stood up to mining companies and territorial governments in defense of what was right? As May stirred beside her and unconsciously reached for Eve's hand in sleep, she began to think maybe she could. After all, sometimes the most important lessons weren't found in books. Sometimes they were written in the tender spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet moments when courage masqueraded as love, and in the simple act of saying yes to possibilities that scared you and thrilled you in equal measure. Outside, Silver Ridge slept under its canopy of stars, dreaming dreams of silver and survival, of families held together by will and hope, and the stubborn refusal to give up. And in a small bedroom off the kitchen of Sullivan Ranch, a widow held an orphan close and tried to imagine a future brave enough to include them both. Eve woke Tuesday morning with her decision crystallized in her heart, like silver ore finally refined into precious metal. The past week had brought a parade of visitors to the ranch, parents expressing their gratitude for their children's education, community members offering support in whatever fight lay ahead, and even a few surprising voices from unexpected quarters. The most surprising had been Father Miguel from the Catholic Church in town, who'd arrived Sunday afternoon with a proposition that took everyone by surprise. Mrs. Morrison, he'd said in his careful English, colored by Spanish accents, I understand you face difficulties with the mining company, yes? Yes, Father. They want to control what I teach the children. This is not acceptable. The church has always supported education for all God's children, not just those whose parents work for mining companies. He'd pause, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap. I have spoken with Bishop Martinez in Denver. If you were to marry Mr. Sullivan, the church would be honored to sanction your school as an official Catholic educational institution. This would provide protection under territorial law that even the mining company could not challenge. The offer had been generous beyond belief, especially considering that Eve wasn't Catholic and had no intention of converting. But Father Miguel had waved away such concerns with the philosophical flexibility of a man who'd spent decades ministering to a diverse frontier community. God's work takes many forms, Senora. Teaching children to read and think and grow in wisdom. This is holy work regardless of the denomination of the teacher. Now, standing at her bedroom window and watching Jacob work with the horses in the morning light, Eve felt the rightness of her decision settle over her like a warm shawl. She wasn't marrying him solely to save the school, though that was certainly part of it. She was marrying him because somewhere in the past weeks, the Sullivan family had become her family in every way that mattered. Miss Mama Eve, May's sleepy voice interrupted her thoughts. Are you getting married to Papa today? Eve turned from the window to find 6 pairs of eyes watching her from the doorway. All the Sullivan children clustered together in their night clothes with expressions ranging from hopeful to anxious. How did you... We heard you and Papa talking last night, Sam said matter-of-factly. Wasn't trying to listen, but voices carry in this old house. And, Eve asked, suddenly nervous about their reaction. And we think it's about time, Kit declared, with the authority of someone who'd been managing household affairs for years. We've been a family in everything but name for weeks now. You sure you want to be stuck with us forever? Tommy asked with a grin that didn't quite hide his underlying worry. Eve knelt down and opened her arms, gathering all 6 children into a hug that felt like coming home. I can't think of anything I'd rather be stuck with. Does this mean you'll really be our mama? Grace asked softly. Not just Miss Mama Eve, but really truly our mama. If you'll have me. Forever and always, May declared, with the certainty of a child who'd never doubted the outcome. I told you that you were our angel. An hour later, Eve found herself standing in the kitchen, trying to compose a response to Theodore Jameson, while the children buzzed around her with wedding preparations that seemed to be organizing themselves. Kit had appointed herself coordinator of the event, Rebecca was planning music, and Tommy was carving something that might eventually become a wedding ring. Dear Mr. Jameson, she wrote carefully, thank you for your generous offer of employment. However, I must inform you that my circumstances have changed. As of this afternoon, I will be Mrs. Jacob Sullivan, and the school will continue operating under the protection of church sanction and territorial marriage law. I trust this resolves any concerns about proper authorization. She signed it with a flourish and handed it to Sam to deliver to town. Make sure you give it to him personally. Yes, ma'am, Sam grinned. Can I wait around to see his face when he reads it? Absolutely not. Deliver the message and come straight home. We have a wedding to prepare for. The wedding itself was everything a hasty frontier ceremony should be. Simple, heartfelt, and blessed by the presence of people who genuinely cared about the participants. Father Miguel performed the service under the big cottonwood tree beside the ranch house, with the entire community of Silver Ridge in attendance. Mary Brennan was there with her children, having made the trip from town specifically to witness the ceremony. The Santos family came, along with the Hendersons, the O'Malleys, and even gruff old Jim Walsh with his arms still in slings. Eve wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, with wild flowers in her hair that Grace had picked from the recovering garden. Jacob had managed to find a proper suit somewhere and looked handsome enough to make her heart skip despite the practical nature of their arrangement. Do you, Evelyn Morrison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? Eve looked into Jacob's storm-gray eyes and saw not just the man she was marrying, but the future they were choosing to build together. I do. And do you, Jacob Sullivan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Jacob said, his voice steady and sure. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado and the Catholic Church, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The kiss was gentle, respectful, and somehow managed to convey both the practical nature of their arrangement and the genuine affection that was growing between them. When they broke apart, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers and applause, with Tommy's whoops of joy carrying clearly above the rest. Ladies and gentlemen, Father Miguel announced with satisfaction, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Jacob Sullivan, and may God bless their union with many years of happiness. The celebration that followed was exactly what Silver Ridge needed after weeks of uncertainty and grief. Consuela Santos had prepared enough food to feed an army, Patrick O'Malley had brought his fiddle, and Mary Henderson had somehow managed to produce a wedding cake that was only slightly lopsided. Children ran between the adults' legs while their parents danced to music that drifted across the valley like joy made audible. It was during the dancing that Theodore Jameson made his appearance. Eve saw him first, standing at the edge of the celebration with his fancy buggy and his calculating expression, clearly trying to assess this new development. She touched Jacob's arm and nodded toward their uninvited guest. "Mr. Jameson," Jacob said pleasantly as they approached, "what brings you out to our wedding celebration?" "Your wife sent me quite an interesting message this morning," Jameson replied, his tone suggesting the message had not been entirely welcome. "Something about changed circumstances and church sanction." "That's right," Eve said calmly. "I'm afraid I won't be available for employment with the mining company after all. My duties as wife and mother will keep me quite busy enough." "And the school?" "Will continue operating as a private family educational enterprise under church protection. Perfectly legal under territorial law, as I'm sure you're aware." Jameson's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Sullivan, I think you're making a mistake. The mining company has significant influence in this territory. It would be unfortunate if that influence were turned against you and your family enterprise." It was Jacob who answered, and Eve felt a chill of recognition as she heard echoes of the sheriff he'd once been in his voice. "Mr. Jameson, I think you're the one making a mistake. My wife has the protection of the church, the law, and this community. She also has the protection of a man who spent 5 years wearing a badge and still has friends in the territorial government. I'd think very carefully before making any threats against my family." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Eve could practically see the calculations running through Jameson's mind. A mining company representative threatening a former sheriff's wife and children would not play well with the territorial authorities, especially when that wife was operating a legally sanctioned educational institution. "Of course," Jameson said finally, his smile returning but not reaching his eyes. "I wasn't making threats, merely expressing concern for Mrs. Sullivan's welfare. I'm sure everything will work out for the best." "I'm sure it will," Jacob agreed pleasantly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a celebration to get back to." They watched Jameson climb back into his buggy and drive away, and Eve felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Is it really over? For now, he'll try other angles, but the legal protection is real. Father Miguel was right. Even the mining companies can't easily challenge church-sanctioned education. And if they try anyway? Jacob's arm came around her waist, warm and reassuring. "Then they'll discover that threatening my family was the biggest mistake they ever made." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music, laughter, and the kind of celebration that makes memories to last a lifetime. Sam danced with Rebecca while Tommy spun May around until she giggled herself dizzy. Kit found herself partnered with Bobby Turner, who'd been practicing his steps in secret and managed not to step on her feet more than twice. Even Grace emerged from her usual shyness to dance with her new stepfather, her small hand trustingly placed in his large one. It was near midnight when the last guests finally departed, leaving the newly expanded Sullivan family to clean up the remnants of their celebration. The children worked together with the easy cooperation of those accustomed to shared responsibility, and within an hour, the ranch yard looked almost normal again. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jacob said formally as they stood on the porch, watching the children carry the last of the dishes inside, "would you care to take a walk with your husband?" Eve felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with anticipation. They were married now, for better or worse, and there were conversations that needed to happen away from 6 pairs of curious ears. "I'd be honored, Mr. Sullivan." They walked in comfortable silence toward the creek that ran behind the house, its waters silver bright under the full moon. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called across the valley, and the night air carried the scent of pine and possibility. "Any regrets?" Jacob asked when they reached the creek bank. "None," Eve said, surprised by how true that was. "You? Only that I waited so long to ask." He paused, then continued more quietly. "Eve, I know this marriage started as a practical arrangement, but I want you to know what I said about my heart remembering how to feel. That wasn't just talk to convince you to say yes." Eve felt her pulse quicken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between watching you heal injured miners and seeing you fight for our children's education, and witnessing the way you've brought this family back to life. I think I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the night air, like stars waiting to be wished upon, and Eve felt her own heart respond with a recognition that surprised her with its intensity. "Jacob," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice feelings that were still too new and fragile to fully trust. "I'm not asking you to say it back," he said quickly. "I know you married me for the children and the school, and that's enough. I just wanted you to know that this isn't just convenience for me anymore." Eve turned to face him fully, noting the vulnerability in his expression that the moonlight couldn't quite hide. "What if I told you it's not just convenience for me either? What if I said that somewhere between teaching your children and tending your wounded neighbors and watching you be the kind of man who puts family before everything else? What if I said I've been falling too?" Jacob's breath caught audibly. "I'd say that would make me the luckiest man in all of Colorado Territory." "Then consider yourself very lucky indeed, Mr. Sullivan." The kiss that followed was different from their first, deeper, more honest, full of the promise of feelings that were real and growing stronger by the day. When they finally broke apart, Eve felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what her future might hold. "So what happens now?" she asked softly. "Now we go home to our children and start building the life we've chosen together. One day at a time, one lesson at a time, one moment of joy at a time." "Our children," Eve repeated, testing the words. "I like the sound of that." "Good, because I have a feeling they're going to keep us very busy." "Did you see the look on Sam's face when Bobby asked Kit to dance? I think we're going to have our hands full with that boy's protective instincts." Eve laughed, remembering the way Sam had positioned himself strategically nearby throughout Bobby and Kit's entire dance. "He's a good brother. They all are. They're good children, and they're going to be even better with you helping to guide them." They walked back toward the house hand in hand, and Eve marveled at how different everything felt from just that morning. She was still the same woman who'd stepped off the train in Silver Ridge, still the widow trying to rebuild her life from the pieces of loss and hope. But she was also something new now. Wife, mother, teacher, healer, and protector, all rolled into one complicated, challenging, beautiful identity. "Jacob?" she said as they reached the porch steps. "Yes. Thank you for trusting me with your family, for giving me a chance to be part of something wonderful. For—" She paused, then continued with the honesty that had become her trademark. "For helping me remember that love doesn't end with loss. Sometimes it just finds new ways to grow." "Thank you," he replied, "for saying yes to a widower with 6 children and more problems than solutions, for seeing potential where others might see only complications, and for reminding me that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the scariest." Inside the house, they found the children had left a small surprise on the kitchen table, a hand-drawn sign that read, "Welcome home. Mama and Papa Sullivan," in Rebecca's careful script, decorated with Tommy's carved flowers and May's enthusiastic but crooked hearts. "Think they approve?" Jacob asked with amusement. "I think they've been planning this longer than either of us realize," Eve replied, remembering all the small signs she'd missed, the way the children had unconsciously included her in their future plans, the casual way they'd started referring to "when Mama and Papa" instead of "if Miss Eve stays." Smart children, the smartest. And now they're officially ours to worry about, educate, and love for the rest of our lives. Scared? Eve considered the question seriously, thinking about all the challenges that lay ahead. Expanding the school, dealing with the ongoing pressures from the mining company, helping 6 young people navigate the complexities of growing up in a place as harsh and beautiful as Silver Ridge. Terrified, she admitted, and excited, and grateful, and about a dozen other emotions I don't have names for. "Good," Jacob said, pulling her close. "If we weren't scared, it would mean we weren't taking it seriously enough." Later, lying in the small bedroom that was now officially hers to share with her new husband, though they'd agreed to take that transition slowly, Eve stared at the ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of the day's changes. In the space of 12 hours, she'd gone from uncertain teacher to wife, mother, and co-founder of what Father Miguel was already calling the most important educational experiment in the Colorado Territory. Eve, Jacob's voice came softly from the other side of the room where he'd made a temporary bed on the floor, insisting that she keep the real bed until they figured out more permanent arrangements. Yes, I know today was a lot of change all at once. If you need time to adjust, to figure out how you feel about everything. Jacob? Yes? I love you too. The words surprised them both. Eve because she hadn't planned to say them. Jacob because he clearly hadn't expected to hear them so soon. But they hung in the darkness between them like a bridge finally built across the gap between hope and certainty. Really? Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. Really, it scares me half to death, but it's true. I love you. I love our children. And I love the life we're building together. Even though it's complicated and uncertain and probably going to involve more fights with mining companies. Especially because of that, I've learned that the best things in life are usually the ones worth fighting for. They talked quietly for another hour, sharing stories from their past and dreams for their future, slowly weaving together the threads of two separate lives into something that might, with time and patience, become a single beautiful tapestry. Outside, Silver Ridge slept under its protective canopy of stars, and in the Sullivan Ranch house, a new family settled into their first night together, with hearts full of love, minds full of plans, and enough courage between them to face whatever tomorrow might bring. 6 months into their marriage, Eve woke one crisp spring morning to the sound of children's laughter echoing across the ranch yard and the scent of coffee and bacon drifting up from the kitchen below. For a moment, she lay still and simply absorbed the sounds of her family beginning another day. Jacob's deep voice mixing with the children's higher tones, the scrape of chairs around the kitchen table, and May's distinctive giggle that never failed to make Eve smile. The school had grown beyond anything Eve had imagined possible. What had started as lessons around the Sullivan kitchen table had evolved into a 3-room operation that took place in the converted barn, with classes for children aged 4 to 16 and evening sessions for adults who wanted to improve their reading and arithmetic. The territorial government had not only approved their educational program, but had designated it as an official demonstration school, sending visitors from as far away as Denver to observe their innovative teaching methods. Mama Eve, May's voice carried up the stairs, followed by the sound of small feet on wooden steps. Papa says breakfast is ready, and Sam caught 3 fish in the creek, and Bobby's here with a letter from the territorial education people. Eve smiled at the breathless rush of information. At 4.5, May had appointed herself as the family's chief communication officer, ensuring that no news went unshared and no detail was overlooked in her reports. I'll be right down, sweetheart, Eve called back, quickly braiding her hair and smoothing her dress. In the 6 months since their wedding, she and Jacob had found their rhythm as partners in every sense of the word, sharing household responsibilities, parenting decisions, and the endless challenges of running both a ranch and a school. Their romantic relationship had deepened gradually, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that had slowly blossomed into something deeper and more passionate than either had expected. The careful distance they'd maintained in the early weeks of marriage had given way to an easy intimacy that felt both thrilling and completely natural. Downstairs, she found organized chaos in the kitchen as the family prepared for another busy day. Rebecca was helping Grace pack lunches for the younger children while Kit supervised Tommy's attempt to clean the fish Sam had caught. Sam himself was deep in conversation with Bobby Turner, who'd become a regular fixture at the ranch and was clearly sweet on Kit, much to Sam's protective dismay. Morning, Mrs. Sullivan, Bobby said, jumping to his feet when Eve entered the kitchen. Got a letter here from the Territorial Education Commissioner. Looks official. Eve accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly. Official correspondence from the territorial government could mean good news or bad, and there was no way to tell which until she opened it. Well, Jacob asked, appearing at her shoulder as she broke the wax seal. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, Eve read aloud, the Territory of Colorado is pleased to inform you that your educational program has been selected as the model for rural school development throughout the Western Territories. We would like to invite you to present your methods at the Territorial Education Conference in Denver this fall, with all expenses paid by the territorial government. The kitchen erupted in cheers and excited chatter, but Eve continued reading. Furthermore, we are prepared to offer funding for expansion of your program, including the construction of dedicated school buildings and the hiring of additional teachers. They want to expand our school? Rebecca asked, her eyes bright with excitement. It sounds like they want to use our school as an example for others, Jacob said, pride evident in his voice. Eve, this is incredible. There's more, Eve said, scanning the rest of the letter. They're offering Jacob a position as regional education supervisor, overseeing the development of similar programs throughout Colorado Territory. The silence that followed was profound, as everyone absorbed the implications of what was being offered. It was recognition beyond their wildest dreams, validation that what they'd built together was not just successful, but revolutionary. What does that mean for us? Grace asked quietly. Would we have to leave the ranch? No, sweetheart, Jacob said quickly. The position would be based here, with travel as needed. We wouldn't have to leave our home. And the school? Kit wanted to know. Would it still be our school? Eve folded the letter carefully, her mind already working through the possibilities and challenges. It would still be our school, but it would also become something bigger. We'd have the resources to help more children, train more teachers, maybe even establish libraries and advanced programs. It's a lot to think about, Jacob said diplomatically, but Eve could see the excitement in his eyes. He'd thrown himself into the educational work with the same dedication he'd once brought to law enforcement, and the idea of expanding their impact clearly appealed to him. We don't have to decide right away, Eve said, but it's an incredible opportunity. The morning lessons proceeded with an undercurrent of excitement as word of the letter spread among the students. By afternoon, parents were arriving to discuss what the territorial recognition might mean for their children's futures. Mary Brennan walked over from town with her 3 children, her face glowing with hope as she talked about the possibilities that formal recognition might bring. My oldest boy is smart as a whip, she said, watching her 9-year-old son work through a mathematics problem that would have challenged students twice his age. But I never dreamed he'd have the chance for real advanced education out here. If you could expand the program, maybe bring in specialized teachers? That's exactly what we're thinking, Eve said. Imagine having teachers for advanced mathematics, sciences, literature, even music and art. We could offer the kind of education that children in cities take for granted. It was Consuela Santos who raised the question that had been lurking in everyone's minds. And the mining company? What do they think of all this attention to your school? The truth was, the mining company had been surprisingly quiet since the wedding. Theodore Jameson had made a few half-hearted attempts to cause trouble, questioning the school's funding sources, suggesting that too much education made workers uppity, but the territorial government's support had effectively silenced such criticism. I think they've realized they can't fight the territorial government, Jacob said, especially when the governor himself has written letters praising our program. Plus, Sam added with a grin that reminded Eve of his father, hard to argue with results. Half their workers can read and write better now, and the other half want to learn. Makes for a more skilled workforce. That evening, after the children were finally settled and the last of the visiting parents had departed, Eve and Jacob sat on their porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The letter from the territorial government lay on the table between them, its implications still sinking in. It's everything we dreamed of and more, Eve said quietly. Why do I feel scared? Because it's big, bigger than anything either of us imagined when we started this. Success can be as frightening as failure, sometimes. What if we're not ready? What if we can't live up to their expectations? Jacob reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become second nature to them both. Then we'll figure it out as we go, the same way we figured out everything else. Together. The children are excited about it. Of course they are. Sam's already talking about studying engineering if we can bring in advanced mathematics teachers. Rebecca wants to know if we could establish a real library with books she hasn't read yet. Even May is planning what she'll teach the other little children when she gets older. Eve smiled, thinking of their youngest daughter's earnest declaration that she wanted to be a teacher mama, just like Eve. They've all grown so much this year. So have we. A year ago, I was a widower struggling to keep his family together and his ranch profitable. Now I'm married to the most remarkable woman in Colorado Territory and co-running an educational program that's changing children's lives. A year ago, I was a lonely widow looking for purpose and a way to earn my keep. Now I'm mother to 6 amazing children and married to a man who makes me believe in the future again. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the familiar sounds of their evening world. Cattle lowing in the distance, the creek murmuring behind the house, and the soft voices of their children drifting down from the loft where they were supposed to be sleeping, but were clearly still talking about the day's excitement. "Jacob?" Eve said finally. I think we should say yes. To all of it? The conference, the expansion, the regional position? To all of it. Not because we're not scared, but because we are. Because the work we're doing matters, and if we can help other communities build schools like ours, then we have an obligation to try. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and Eve could practically hear him thinking through all the implications and challenges they'd face. Finally, he squeezed her hand and smiled. "Then I guess we better start planning. Because if we're going to change education throughout the Colorado Territory, we're going to need a bigger barn." 3 months later, Eve stood before an audience of 200 educators, government officials, and community leaders in Denver's finest hotel and tried to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. Jacob sat in the front row with their 6 children, all dressed in their finest clothes and beaming with pride. In the audience, she could see familiar faces from Silver Ridge. Father Miguel, the Santos family, even gruff old Jim Walsh, who'd insisted on making the trip to see his teacher speak to the territorial bigwigs. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice stronger than she felt, "I want to tell you about a school that started around a kitchen table with 6 children who'd been forgotten by the educational system." As she spoke about their methods, their successes, and their vision for the future, Eve felt the fear gradually give way to passion. This was what she'd been born to do. Not just teach children, but fight for their right to learn and grow, and dream beyond the limitations others might try to impose on them. When she finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained, but it was the tears in Jacob's eyes and the proud smiles on her children's faces that meant the most. Later, at the reception following her presentation, Eve found herself surrounded by educators and officials, eager to learn more about their program. The territorial governor himself spent 20 minutes discussing plans for expanding similar schools throughout Colorado, and representatives from 3 other territories expressed interest in adapting their methods. "You've done something remarkable," the governor told her as the evening wound down. "Not just in terms of educational innovation, but in proving that excellence can flourish anywhere when people are committed to making it happen." "We had excellent raw material to work with," Eve replied, glancing over at her family. "The children of Silver Ridge were always special. They just needed someone to believe in their potential. And now they'll have the resources to reach that potential, thanks to you and your husband." The ride back to Silver Ridge took 2 days, but it felt like a journey through a dream. The territorial funding had been approved unanimously. Construction on new school buildings would begin within the month, and applications for teaching positions were already pouring in from across the country. "Are you ready for all this change?" Rebecca asked as they crested the final hill before home, the familiar silhouette of the ranch buildings coming into view. "I'm ready for anything as long as we're facing it together," Eve replied, and meant every word. The ranch looked exactly the same, but somehow felt completely different. This was no longer just their home. It was the headquarters of an educational revolution that would touch the lives of children throughout the American West. That night, after the excitement had died down and the children were finally asleep, Eve and Jacob walked out to their favorite spot by the creek and stood looking up at the stars that had witnessed so many changes in their lives. "Any regrets about the quiet life we're leaving behind?" Jacob asked. "None," Eve said firmly. "We were never meant for quiet lives anyway. We were meant for this, for building something that matters, for fighting for children who need champions, for proving that education can transform communities, for falling in love with each other along the way." Eve turned to face her husband. This man who'd given her not just a home and family, but a purpose worthy of her dreams. Especially for that. Good, Jacob said, pulling her close, because I have a feeling the best is yet to come. As they kissed under the Colorado stars, surrounded by the sounds of their sleeping ranch and their growing family, Eve knew he was right. They'd built something beautiful from the ashes of loss and the courage of new beginnings. They'd created a school that was changing lives, a family that was stronger than the sum of its parts, and a love that had grown from practical necessity into something as precious and enduring as the silver veins that ran through the mountains around them. 5 years later, the sound of children's voices echoed across the Silver Ridge Valley as Eve stood on the porch of what had once been a simple ranch house and was now the administrative center of the Colorado Territorial Education Initiative. 3 large school buildings dotted the landscape around the original ranch, connected by covered walkways and surrounded by gardens where students learned botany alongside their letters and numbers. Mama Eve! Mama Eve! May's voice, now 9 years old and full of authority, carried across the yard. The new teachers are here from back east, and Tommy caught a snake, and Grace wants to know if she can use the good china for the tea party she's having with the kindergarten students. Eve smiled at the familiar rush of information. Some things never changed, no matter how much their world had expanded. May was still the family's chief communication officer, though she now had competition from the dozen other children who'd joined the Sullivan family over the years. Orphans and foundlings who'd found their way to Silver Ridge and somehow never left. Tell Grace she can use the second-best china, Eve called back, and ask Tommy to please take his snake to the nature study area where it belongs. The ranch now housed not just the Sullivan family, but 8 full-time teachers, 3 administrative staff, and a constantly rotating population of visiting educators from across the American West. The original kitchen table where it all began had been preserved in a place of honor in the main school building, with a small plaque that read, "Where great dreams begin with simple faith." Jacob emerged from the largest school building with a stack of papers in his hands and the satisfied expression of a man who'd found his true calling. As regional education supervisor, he spent his days visiting schools throughout Colorado Territory, training teachers in the methods they'd developed, and fighting bureaucratic battles to ensure that every child had access to quality education, regardless of their family's economic status. "How did the morning classes go?" Eve asked as he joined her on the porch. "Beautifully. The new mathematics teacher from Boston is settling in well, and the students are fascinated by the science experiments. Sam's got half the boys convinced they want to be engineers now." "And the other half? Want to be teachers, like their mama." Eve felt the familiar glow of pride mixed with amazement. At 16, Sam had grown into a natural leader who'd been accepted to the Colorado School of Engineering, but had chosen to defer for a year to help train new student teachers at Silver Ridge. Kit, at 15, was already teaching the younger children while pursuing her own advanced studies. Rebecca had become the school's librarian and was cataloging what had grown into one of the finest collections of books west of the Mississippi. Tommy, now 12, divided his time between studying and what he called practical education, which seemed to involve catching various creatures and explaining their biology to anyone who'd listen. Grace, at 10, had inherited her mother's gift for healing and spent her afternoons in the herb garden that had expanded into a full medicinal plant research facility. And May was, quite simply, the heart of everything they'd built, the child who remembered everyone's birthdays, organized surprise celebrations, and somehow made every new arrival feel like they'd been part of the family forever. "Any word from the territorial capital about the proposal for teacher training colleges?" Eve asked, settling into the rocking chair that had been Jacob's wedding gift to her 3 years earlier. "Good news and complicated news," Jacob said, taking his own chair beside her. "They've approved funding for 5 regional training colleges. The complicated part is they want us to consider establishing the flagship program here, which would mean expanding again." Eve looked out across their valley, taking in the organized bustle of what had become the most respected educational institution in the American West. Children from Silver Ridge learned alongside scholarship students from across the territory, while their teachers trained educators who carried the Sullivan method to communities from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. "More buildings?" she asked. "More everything. More students, more teachers, more programs." They're talking about adding secondary education certification, specialized programs for rural teachers, even a research division to study and improve educational methods. That would make us a college. That would make us the most important teacher training institution west of the Mississippi. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their expanded family go about the business of learning and growing and becoming the people they were meant to be. Mary Brennan walked past with her youngest daughter, both of them on their way to the advanced mathematics class that Mary was taking while her daughter attended kindergarten. Bobby Turner and Kit could be seen through the window of the literature classroom, team teaching a group of teenage students with the easy partnership that spoke of both professional respect and personal affection. They'd announced their engagement the previous month, with plans to marry after Kit finished her teaching certification. "It's so much bigger than anything we imagined," Eve said finally. "Are you overwhelmed?" "I'm grateful, terrified and exhausted and constantly amazed, but grateful above all else." A commotion from the direction of the main school building caught their attention. A group of students had gathered around someone in the yard, and Eve could hear excited voices carrying across the distance. "What do you suppose that's about?" Jacob asked. Before Eve could answer, Sam came jogging toward the house with his characteristic purposeful stride. At 16, he'd grown tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but his face still lit up with boyish enthusiasm when something truly excited him. "Ma, Pa, you need to come see this," he called. "There's a delegation here from Washington, D.C. They want to talk to you about establishing Sullivan Method schools throughout all the Western territories." Eve felt her heart skip a beat. "Washington? The federal government is interested in our program," Sam continued breathlessly. "They're talking about funding, about making our methods the standard for rural education across the entire American West." Jacob stood slowly, his expression shifting into the careful neutrality he wore when processing important news. "How many people are we talking about?" "6 officials, including someone from the Department of Education and a representative from the Secretary of the Interior's office. They've been touring the schools all morning, and they want to meet with you both this afternoon." Eve looked at Jacob, seeing her own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in his storm-gray eyes. They dreamed of helping children throughout Colorado territory. The possibility of influencing education across the entire American West was almost too big to comprehend. "I suppose we should go meet our visitors," she said, smoothing her skirts and checking her hair in the way of women everywhere when faced with unexpected important company. "Are you ready for this?" Jacob asked quietly. Eve looked around at everything they'd built together. The schools filled with laughing children, the gardens where students learned about life and growth, the buildings that housed teachers dedicated to nurturing young minds, and the family that had grown from 6 grieving individuals into a thriving clan of educators and dreamers. "I'm ready for anything," she said, taking his hand, "as long as we're facing it together." As they walked toward the main school building to meet the representatives from Washington, Eve thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd stepped off a train in Silver Ridge 5 years ago as a lonely widow looking for purpose and a way to earn her keep. Now she was walking into a meeting that could shape the future of education across the American frontier. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in their work or their recognition or their expanded family. It was in her own heart, which had learned to love again in ways she'd never thought possible. She'd discovered that sometimes the most profound changes began with the simplest acts of faith. Saying yes to an uncertain future, opening your heart to unexpected possibilities, and believing that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together toward a common dream. Behind them, the sounds of Silver Ridge continued. Children learning, teachers teaching, and families growing stronger through the simple but revolutionary idea that education was not a privilege to be rationed, but a right to be celebrated. And in the distance, barely visible against the afternoon sky, another train was pulling into Silver Ridge Station, carrying new teachers, new students, and new dreamers who would help carry their work into an even brighter future. Thank you for joining the Sullivan family on their journey from loss to love, from simple dreams to extraordinary accomplishments. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Do you have a teacher who changed your life the way Eve changed Silver Ridge? Share your story with our community, because just like Eve learned, the most powerful education happens when we learn from each other. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our heartwarming stories of family, courage, and second chances. Your support helps us bring you more tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And remember, sometimes the most important lessons aren't found in books, but in the courage to say yes to love, to take chances on people who need champions, and to believe that ordinary families can accomplish extraordinary things when they work together toward a common dream.